right, it's great to see everyone. It looks like we have more than 30 people with everyone partnering up in their homes and on the screen. This is an important conversation for community, for us as human beings. Sue Linderman, thank you for dedicating your time to the people of community and beyond. And we look forward to opening our ears and our hearts and our minds. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I am so grateful to be here. I'm going to begin with a brief introduction. I am indeed so grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, graduating from Mount Pleasant Public High School before going on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science at Mount Holyoke College. My 27-year career with the DuPont Company culminated in the spin-off of its medical X-ray business via a leveraged buyout that created Sterling Diagnostic Imaging, of which I was its first president. I am especially proud of the long-term R&D investment by my business that developed a selenium array for image capture that is now at the heart of virtually every mammography machine in use in the United States. I'm a co-founder of Westminster's Peace and Justice Work Group in Wilmington that was formed in the spring of 2018 with the twin goals of combating violence in the city of Wilmington and promoting racial justice. That work group is affiliated with a large number of community organizations with similar goals: the Delaware Center for Justice, the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, Peace Week Delaware, Smart Justice Delaware, and many others. I grew up in a virtually all-white environment. Until I graduated from high school, the only Black person I knew was our mailman, Mr. Brown. Then two significant events occurred. My summer job that year, taking the first Delaware state census, had me going door to door throughout the city of Wilmington, conversing with hundreds of people who didn't look like me. That fall, I found myself on a multiracial campus at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 1963 to 1967. And those experiences launched a journey that continues to this day. I've had a lifelong interest in history, and I was a political science history major, but I didn't discover until 7 or 8 years ago that I was missing a significant portion of our country's history. In my experience, American history classes covered Columbus, the Pilgrims, the Revolutionary War, then the Civil War, and those darn carpetbaggers, a bit of Reconstruction, and it picked up again sometime after World War II. It was the series of police shootings of unarmed Black men in recent years that galvanized me to develop a better understanding of how we got to where we are. And what I learned is that much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold ourselves are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and biased beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Other countries with similarly sordid racial pasts have sought to move forward via a process often called truth and reconciliation. I believe America is in desperate need of such a process. So we here, for these 6 weeks, will embark on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, especially for those of us who profess to believe that every person is a child of God, who believe that we are good people who seek justice and peace for everyone. I believe that in bringing to light this history of ours that we should have known but didn't, we may be transformed in deeply meaningful ways with a new or a renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address the profound inequities that persist in our society today. So let's get started. This is part 1 of 6, the early years. I'm going to begin with some quick definitions as grounding for us. The first is the word prejudice, which is an unfavorable opinion or feeling that is formed often without personal knowledge, thought, or reason. And the stereotypes and the prejudices that exist on the basis of race in our country are a profound effect of the segregation of the races that occurred beginning following the Civil War. Obviously, slavery had its own form of segregation, but we will see how government actions separated us so that without personal knowledge, what rushes to fill the vacuum are stereotypes, things that we've heard, prejudices that we pick up from other people. White supremacy is an essential term for our history, and I'm not talking about white supremacists, the tiki torch carrying, chanting, violent individuals that we sometimes see appear in our communities or on our television screens. White supremacy is basically a belief that white people are inherently superior to people from other racial groups, especially Black people, and as a consequence are rightfully the dominant group in any society. A belief that if you're white, you're somehow better. And we're going to see the threads of that throughout our history and into today. Racism is discrimination directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. But it is not just the words we say. It is actually a system. It is a system of prejudice backed by, supported by power. And so people will say, well, can't Black people be racist? And I think the answer to that is no. Black people can be prejudiced against white people. They can be antagonistic. They can be hateful. But there is no system of power that Black people have that they can exert over white people. And that is the definition of racism. It is a system. And then we are going to learn how that system developed and is perpetuated. So as we go through this material, I'm going to use a variety of terminology: African, slave, Negro, African American, Black, Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, seeking to be faithful to the time period and the context of what we're working on. Some of these classes include quotations from individuals who use one of the most derogatory terms for Black people. And when that happens, when I give you the quote, I will substitute the phrase, the N-word, rather than use the word itself. So 6 classes we will be together. The first tonight is the early years, from 1619 through the Civil War and Reconstruction, most notably in the British colonies. Next week, we will turn to a period of our history about which I think the least is known, and that epoch I have labeled Slavery by Another Name. Author and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, has famously said that slavery didn't end.
I'm coming back behind you.
Slavery didn't end with the Civil War. It evolved. And we will see that evolution beginning next week. In our third class, we move into the 20th century, and we look at significant programs of public policy and key events of the civil rights movement. In week 4, we turn our attention to the criminal justice system in the United States and its history in the view of mass incarceration and the war on drugs. Week 5, we will look at voter suppression then and now, today and tomorrow and the next day. And then what I think is arguably the most important of the 6 classes, once we have gained new knowledge, renewed knowledge of our country's history that has led us to this point, the fundamental question is, where do we go from here? Education is essential, but not just for its own sake. It is so that it grounds us in the work ahead, what we are called to do, who we are called to be. So that's the structure. So we begin. It is a hot summer day, August 20th, 1619, and we are in the British colony of Virginia, standing on Point Comfort in Jamestown, and we're looking east across the ocean, and a ship appears on the horizon. It's headed our way, and when it comes ashore, we learn that it is the White Lion. It is a British privateer ship, and it has had a very difficult crossing from Africa. It's in need of resupply and repairs. And so we colonists, as we are accustomed, step forward to help meet the needs of the captain and his crew. And in return for our efforts, we are paid by the delivery of 20 plus kidnapped Angolans. This marks the first time that Africans set foot in the British colonies in the New World. Now, at the time, the primary crop in Virginia and the other colonies was tobacco. They were able to continue to grow tobacco by taking more and more land from the indigenous people who were here, because tobacco is very hard on the soil, and it leaches out the nutrients, making it very difficult to replant that crop in the same ground year after year. And so the proliferation of the tobacco crop is what began the spread westward. And the colonists basically had the wherewithal to take all of the land that they wanted from the indigenous people who were there. The colonists, however, found that the native peoples, the indigenous peoples, were not the ideal workers for the plantations for a number of reasons. For one, the Europeans brought with them certain diseases for which the indigenous people here had no immunity, and it resulted in the deaths of many of the people originally here. Wars that broke out sometimes between tribes, but often between the colonists and the indigenous people, resulted in fewer and fewer people available to work. And in reality, you could not force an indigenous person to work because it was easy for them to escape. After all, it was their land. They knew the land. They knew the people in the surrounding areas. And so the colonists initially turned to the economic system of indentured servitude. And they recruited poor Europeans, poor Western Europeans, to come to the New World, typically under contract, a 7-year contract, during which the individual would work for the colonists for no pay, but room and board. And at the end of the contract period, they would be released from that commitment, often given a plot of land for themselves and the wherewithal to establish themselves in the community. And so that was the system, the employment system in place when those first Africans began to arrive. And so initially, the Africans were folded into the indentured servant system. They were put under contract, just like the Western Europeans, which is why you will hear stories of Africans or African Americans who were landowners in the early days, who even owned slaves themselves, because when they first arrived, they were incorporated into that same indentured servitude system. But as time went on, the process known as the transatlantic slave trade grew exponentially and brought millions of Africans to the New World. Portugal, Great Britain, Spain, France, Holland, and Denmark were the 6 main Western European nations who orchestrated the transatlantic slave trade over these decades. Over this period of time, more than 20 million Africans were taken from their homes, and they were transported or marched to the coast to be loaded onto ships. But that transit from their homes to the ships was grueling enough, and nearly half of them died before they made it to the coastal areas. And so ultimately, 10.7 million Africans were transported to the New World. And during what was called the Middle Passage, more than 2 million of them died. This is a schematic of a slave ship that was used to transport the Africans. When they arrived at the coast, they were branded with hot irons and restrained with shackles. Their living quarters were often a deck within the ship that had less than 5 feet of headroom. And throughout a large portion of the deck, sleeping shelves cut this limited amount of headroom in half. Lack of standing headroom was the least of the slaves' problems, though, with 300 to 400 people packed in a tiny area, an area with little ventilation, and in some cases, not even enough space to place buckets for human waste, as you see in the lower schematic. Disease was prevalent. So that the largest possible cargo might be carried, the captives were wedged below decks, chained to low-lying platforms stacked in tiers, with an average individual space allotment that was 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and perhaps 3 feet high. Unable to stand erect or turn over, many slaves died in this position, and over the course of the transatlantic slave trade, 2 million met that fate. Captains' logs record schools of sharks that used to follow the slave ships because they knew, their experience was, that there would be a ready supply of food as the corpses were tossed overboard. And that was the mechanism that brought Africans to the New World. It was called the Middle Passage because the first leg of the 3-part journey was from Western Europe to Africa, where goods were exchanged for kidnapped Africans, brought to the New World, exchanged for goods, and returned to Western Europe. That Middle Passage typically took anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. And so the slaves being transported were held in this fashion for that extent of time. As I indicated, the first few Africans who came were treated as indentured servants, but as the transatlantic slave trade built its momentum and its numbers, differentiation began to take hold. The Europeans who were here as indentured servants were covered by British common law, and they were asserted to be free people. but that British common law did not cover the Africans. Also, the church mandated that Christians be treated as free people, but the Africans, as they arrived, were not Christians, and the church did not see them as free. And as time went on and missionaries worked to convert Africans to Christianity, even after that conversion, the church did not see them as the same level of Christian as whites with the associated freedom. And so differentiation began to take hold on the basis of skin color. And the institution of slavery was legalized in the period from 1641 to 1750. Massachusetts was actually the first colony to legalize slavery in 1641, and Georgia was the last in 1750. How was that done? Laws were passed in the colonies and then the states that declared that these Africans were chattel. They were property, and they were owned for life. There was no earning your way out of slavery. There was no release. You were enslaved for life. And further, the condition of slavery was hereditary to your children through the mother. Now, this ran counter to every other protocol of legacy or inheritance at the time, where everything else was through the male, except in the case of slavery, where if your mother was a slave for life, then you as her child were a slave for life as well. Now, in the North, most of the Africans were house servants or unpaid skilled labor. Many of these Africans were artisans. They brought with them skills and trades and capabilities, and they were able to exercise those in the North, but not to be paid for their skills or their capabilities. But even in the North, they were relegated to a subhuman status. The laws provided that slaves could not be taught to read or write. They were not allowed to marry officially, legitimately marry. And a new identity based on the social construct of race took hold. Along with it, the myth of racial inferiority developed, and it persisted as a justification for the system. And we'll see that as the United States were formed with its lofty goals, you would say, given those values, how could you own people as property? How could you treat them that way? Well, you had to have a justification, a distinction that said these are not the same kind of people. The first reference to white people in the New World appeared in 1671 in print. Because until the Africans were here in any significant numbers, white had no meaning. People who came from Western Europe were Polish or Italian or Danish or Welsh or Scottish, or there was no white people until there was a body of Black people that enabled the construct to say all of those others from Western Europe are considered white. Originally, white meant Anglo-Saxon, but with time, other ethnic groups were added to that white characterization. And you know, when I first began doing this work, I saw a mention of Bacon's Rebellion, but I didn't know anything about it. I didn't think too much about it. But it turns out that it was a really significant event in our country's history. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy white property owner, and he was a relative of Virginia's governor, William Berkeley. But Bacon and Berkeley didn't like each other, and they disagreed over issues on how the colony should be governed. including the colony's policy toward Native Americans. Bacon wanted the colony to retaliate for raids by Native Americans on frontier settlements and remove all the Native Americans from the colony so that landowners like himself could expand their property. But Berkeley feared that doing that would unite all of the neighboring tribes in opposition to the colonists, and so he refused. As a consequence, Bacon formed his own militia that was made up of enslaved Black people, poor Black people, and poor white people. And he began to attack the neighboring tribes, and his militia even attacked the Virginia militia. And in September 1676, Bacon's militia captured Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Although Bacon died of a fever a month later and the rebellion fell apart, Virginia's wealthy planters were shaken by the fact that a rebel militia that united white and Black servants and slaves had destroyed the colonial capital. And so they set about crafting laws that would differentiate between the white residents and the Black poor people, certainly the Black slaves. And they began giving slight advantages to the poor white people and began driving a wedge between Black and white, the people with the least means. And what we see today is the echo of that, where people who are poor, crossing racial lines, cannot see their common need, their common humanity, their common need for assistance and resolution. And that began in 1676 with Nathaniel Bacon and the white planters. We move forward, and from 1774 to 1804, the northern colonies and states abolished slavery. It was less efficient in the North. It was not the underpinning of an agricultural economy, and it became less socially accepted. And so we come to the period of time where we look at the formation of the United States, the creation and adoption of the United States Constitution. So the northern colonies and the southern colonies needed to compromise in untold ways in order to put the Constitution together. And the first question had to do with representation. How many people live in your colony, your state? Because your representation in Congress is based on that population. The southern colonies clearly wanted every slave to count as the population. The northern colonies did not want that because it would dilute their power. And so the compromise that was worked out and written into the Constitution of the United States is that a slave would count as 3/5 of a person, not a whole person. Native Americans, indigenous people, didn't count at all. In fact, the only reference to indigenous people in all of the founding documents is in the Declaration of Independence, where they are described as, quote, merciless Indian savages, period. Also written into the Constitution was a fugitive slave clause that said that any slave escaping from the South to the North could not be relieved of that condition, and in fact had to be returned to his or her owner. And even further, in 1793, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act that authorized local governments to seize and return escapees to their owners and imposed penalties on anyone who aided in their flight, be it through the Underground Railroad or any one of a number of ways in which slaves sought their freedom by moving to the North. And even more intriguingly and less visible is that in 1808, the United States outlawed the importing of slaves. it turns out that Great Britain stopped its participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. And so people thought, well, maybe that's why, there just weren't as many slaves coming across the ocean. And so the United States decided to stop participating. But it wasn't that simple, because written into the Constitution was the idea that maybe someday the United States might want to stop importing slaves, but the Constitution required that at least 20 years needed to go by before Congress could be authorized to stop the slave trade. And so the Constitution provides that continuing influx of slaves from Africa would continue for at least 20 years. So even though it was outlawed, it didn't necessarily stop. But the numbers decreased dramatically. And so the country turned to a domestic trade, a self-reproducing labor force. And that was carried out through auctions that took place. Over the period of time, more than 1.2 million slaves were sold at auction. Families were split up. Half of all slaves were separated from a child or children or their spouse. 1/3 of all marriages, even though not legal in the state's regulation, nevertheless, 1/3 of those relationships were divided as the male was sold to a different owner than the female. And Charleston, South Carolina, became the slave trade capital of North America. Here is a poster you would find on a bulletin board or elsewhere in the community, the Great Negro Mart in Memphis, Tennessee. The undersigned would announce to the community at large that they will keep constantly on hand a general assortment of Negroes at private sale and at auction. Here is a representation of one such sale. Mary Jane, about 11, Martha, about 10, Louisa, about 7, Priscilla, about 9, all children of Judy, for sale. Imagine being Judy. And it says about because slave children didn't have birth certificates. They weren't people. They had no proof. And often they had no last name, unless perhaps it was the last name of their slave owner, which made it very difficult in later years to try to find your spouse, your child, your parent who had been sold away, because you couldn't identify them. You couldn't find them. A horrific way of treating human beings. So we look at the economic imperative at this point. The agricultural system shifts heavily from tobacco to cotton. Cotton can be replanted in the same ground year after year after year. But you've probably all seen the photographs of enslaved people with bent over with burlap bags around their necks, picking cotton in a field. It was a horrifically time-consuming and painful process. And even worse, once you had picked the cotton, you had to pull the little bold pieces out away from the fiber, and they were sharp, and they cut your fingers, and it was a slow, laborious process. And so the availability of cotton was limited largely by that process until in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which mechanized the extraction of those pieces from the fiber. And so the demand for cotton exploded, and the new United States shifted to a textile economy. And by the mid-1800s, cotton was America's leading export. There was a continuing tension between the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states, though, and it showed up frequently in Congress. And In 1819, 1820, the territory of Missouri petitioned to become a state. But at that time, there were an equal number of states that allowed the ownership of slaves and those that did not. And so in order to admit Missouri to the United States, a portion of Massachusetts was carved away and became the state of Maine. So Maine was admitted as a free state to balance Missouri as a slave state, slave-owning state. And at that time, the Missouri Compromise also declared that there would be no slave-owning states admitted north of the latitude 3630. And that uneasy truce continued for about 30 years until Stephen Douglas wanted Kansas and Nebraska admitted to the United States because he wanted to build a railroad. And so Congress passed what became known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it declared basically that the Missouri Compromise was overturned. And it allowed Kansas and Nebraska to decide by popular sovereignty whether they would allow the ownership of states of slaves or not. The internal divisions weren't quite so easy to manage. However, Kansas had two legislatures for a decade or more, one that governed Kansas saying you could own slaves and one saying that you could not. But this action and this continued tension split the Whig Party between the North and the South. And the Northern Whigs split and formed the Republican Party in 1856. The Republican Party was not opposed to slavery, it was opposed to the expansion of slavery. It was fine with slavery wherever it existed. And then comes a really pivotal Supreme Court decision, and we are going to hear a great deal about Supreme Court decisions during this 6 weeks. This one is the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was born a slave around the turn of the century, and he moved with several different owners to different states, some where he was indeed considered a slave, but some free states where by virtue of being there with his owner, he was considered to be a free man. After his last owner died, Dred Scott and his wife and the other slaves that the owner had reverted to his wife, who refused to grant their freedom. And so he filed suit. Dred Scott and his wife filed suit. And the case ended up in the Supreme Court. It was filed in 1852, and the Dred Scott decision was finally issued in 1857. And it declared that Dred Scott and his wife were not free, could not be free. And further, that was because freeing a slave would deprive the owner of his or her property without due process. We hear a lot about due process these days. But the Dred Scott decision said that Black people, slave or free, could never become citizens, and they had no federal rights. History books say it is widely considered the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court, but I would argue there have been a few here lately that would vie for that title, and we'll leave that for the moment. Chief Justice Taney, in his opinion, wrote, "In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. The Supreme Court ruled. And by 1860, with slavery at its heart, 80% of the US GDP was tied in one fashion or another to slavery. And so we come to the presidential election of 1860. There were actually 4 candidates for president that year, 2 Democrats, John Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas, a Constitutional Union candidate, John Bell, and the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln received 1.8 million votes, but the 2 Democrats together received 2.2 million, but it was split. And so out of the 2.9 million votes cast that year, Abraham Lincoln was named President of the United States. Within 3 months, 7 southern states seceded, followed by 4 more, and then followed by Missouri and Kentucky. You may have heard the question, was the Civil War fought over states' rights, or was it fought over slavery? And the answer to that question is yes. It was fought over the states' rights to maintain the institution of slavery. And we only need to look at the Articles of Secession written by the various states. Mississippi's is one example. Quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun." I guess this was before sunscreen and Caribbean vacations. Anyway. Continuing, these products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow had long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. And even more significantly, on March 21st, 1861, Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, gave what became known as the Cornerstone Speech. He said, "The new, that is, the Confederate Constitution, has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization." This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. The general opinion of the men of that day, that is the revolutionary period, was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution of slavery would become evanescent and pass away. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. And so the Civil War begins in 1861. January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation that frees 4 million slaves in the 10 southern states that are still in rebellion. It does not free the slaves in the border states, Delaware, Maryland, etc. Because he's able to free those slaves, because they are the property of an entity with which the United States is at war. He has jurisdiction over them because they are property of an enemy. but that freeing those slaves deprived the South of most of its labor force. And many of those freed slaves went north and even fought with the Union Army. And so the war was ostensibly lost, although there are interesting perspectives on that yet. And in 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And over the course of the war, the numbers vary somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 Americans were killed, and 1.5 million casualties were left. More than died in every other war, all the other wars ever fought by the United States. And during that period, almost 180,000 African Americans fought in the Union Army, and 40,000 of them were killed in battle. And so the war is over, and Congress moves into what became known as the period of Reconstruction, a period that many of us don't know a great deal about. I mentioned the carpetbaggers. That was sort of my mental piece that I carried away from American history when I was in 8th grade. But in truth, Reconstruction was a pivotal period. It offered a ray of hope for a more perfect union. It began with the passage in January of 1865, before the war even came to an end, and ratified in December that year, of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, with an asterisk. There's a loophole in the 13th Amendment, and we will talk extensively about that next week. So enough states ratified the 13th Amendment that it became part of the Constitution in December of 1865, but not all the states signed on. It took Delaware until 1901 to decide that it wanted to ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Kentucky took longer. The Kentucky legislature in 1976 ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, but they weren't last. Last was Mississippi, who ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 2013. So imagine being an African American living in Mississippi, knowing that your state has not yet decided that slavery should be abolished. That same year, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress. It took ownership of abandoned and confiscated lands, and it was responsible for providing resources to newly freed slaves so that they would have an opportunity for land ownership, for employment, for education. But President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, was a strong sympathizer with the South. And so he pardoned 7,000 secessionists, and he rescinded the land grants made by the Freedmen's Bureau that ushered in the agricultural economic system of sharecropping. The Ku Klux Klan was also established at about that time in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Its initial stated purpose was amusement. If your definition of amusement is wearing a robe and a hood and riding a horse through the ex-slave quarters, the black quarters, firing guns in the middle of the night. But Congress wanted to do more and wanted to protect those newly freed and wanted to be sure that they had the wherewithal to exist and live as citizens of the United States. And so in 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts over Andrew Johnson's veto. and it established 5 military districts for the 10 states that had remained in rebellion. And those states had to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted to the Union. And it was that 14th Amendment, about which we're hearing a great deal even today, that granted citizenship to the African Americans and asserted that they were indeed, that citizenship was to be accompanied by the treatment of due process. The thought was, since Congress had made them citizens in 1868, that they would be able to vote. But violent oppression and efforts to make sure that Black men not vote meant that Congress had to take a step further with the passage in 1870 of the 15th Amendment that explicitly said the right to vote may not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so the elections that took place during that time period were extraordinary. Black adult males could vote and hold office. That first year that was true, the Black voter turnout was nearly 90%. We've never achieved that rate of voter turnout since. Black men were elected to state legislatures, more than 600 of them. 18 state executives were Black men elected. The governor of Louisiana was a Black man, and that's the last time that would happen until 1960. 18 members of the US Congress and 2 United States senators were Black men elected to those positions. And Grant was elected president. And Congress began enacting laws that dealt with public education, with programs of assistance for all, the ability to view Black and white people working collaboratively together in leadership roles offered us a glimpse at what might have been possible. But the tide began to turn, and in 1872, Congress passed the Amnesty Act. It gave amnesty to 150,000 former Confederate troops, and it pardoned all but the top 500 Confederate officers. These were people who understood that they would be adjudged to have committed treason against the United States, might have assumed they would be incarcerated or executed, but instead they were pardoned. And not only that, they could then run for office. And so the fact that those Confederate leaders could run for office, the violence that was visited upon prospective Black voters in subsequent elections meant that that integrated leadership group disappeared almost overnight. And in 1876, Black voters were brutally targeted on Election Day. And through a combination of events, the presidential election was deadlocked. Samuel J. Tilden was the governor of New York. He had all but one of the electoral votes that he needed versus Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the governor of Ohio. But 3 states had their electoral votes in, they hadn't quite decided how to award them. So a panel was created of Congresspeople and Supreme Court justices, 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, who would make the decision on how to award the electoral votes. And they offered to Rutherford B. Hayes that they would award him the electoral votes if he would promise to end Reconstruction and withdraw the federal troops. And he did. And they did. And Rutherford B. Hayes became president of the United States. And in 1877, all of the federal Reconstruction oversight from the South was removed. So a bird's eye view of 250 years of our early history. This is often a time for discussion, question, comments. We are a large group, but I open the floor to you. I think perhaps if you would like to say something, you might use your little raise hand button, if you can find it. And if you can't, you can always do this if you're on the screen, but I would appreciate your thoughts, your comments, your reflections at this point. And you need to unmute yourself. Sandra.
Question I had was early on, you mentioned the church legitimizing slavery. What church are we referring to?
Was the Church of England. That was the
Okay.
one that was overseeing the colonies, right? And that was the church that was largely in effect in the country at the time, the continent, yeah, at the colonies,
At least that colony for sure.
yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Sure.
Surely you all have some questions or give some feedback. I thought it was brilliant. Boy, that was very well done. Thank you, Linda. Did everybody know all this?
I knew a lot of it because I was a history minor. However, there are some things I really just didn't remember correctly at all. The Bacon Rebellion, Dred Scott. I remembered, who the Chief Justice was. I just didn't remember what it was about. I just knew it was bad and had to do with slavery. So I really appreciated the refresher. And thank you. It was very, very well done. Yeah.
I think we're all familiar with major pieces of the framework, if you will, and their terms and things that we recognize. I think it's difficult to see the through thread without stepping back and considering the series of events and the ways in which they're connected.
This is the tattoo. We shall get.
I like that.
Am I right? The woodcuts.
One of the possibilities that I raised in the email was the idea that because we are a large group, discussion is very difficult. And it may be that it would be helpful to have some small group discussions offline after the fact, opportunity to share perspectives, reflections, questions. Perhaps there are things that you wonder about that I didn't cover, or as you reflect on this, something comes up that you wonder about. So I'm not sure what all might work, but I think that there's a pretty basic understanding of the structure for this week's class. I think as we move into next week in particular, the history is difficult, read excruciating. And I think the opportunity for small group discussion, reflection, connection might be really helpful. And even as we move into the 20th century and some of the actions that were taken, some of the public policy that we all know, the Social Security Act and the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration, there are attributes to those that I think once we understand the forces behind them and the decisions that were made, it reshapes our view of why we are the way we are, what's happened. and how we got here.
I have a piece of trivia that might be interesting. One of our former members, Dottie Frank, one of her ancestors was part of Reconstruction. She was sent by the federal government into Charleston to, he was there to keep the order and to run trials. And she and I have had many discussions about a lot of his work and how they almost ran him out of town once the Reconstruction was ended. They hated him so much for the work that he was doing.
There's some questions in the chat about slavery in other countries, and it's worthy of some investigation. Other countries did have slaves, but the institution of slavery, as created by the laws passed in the United States, distinguish us from every other country that had slaves. And it is that institution of slavery predicated on the myth of inferiority that we have never dealt with. That legacy is huge in the United States. I mean, we've seen apartheid in South Africa. We have seen Nazism in Germany. We know that the country of India has a caste system. So, there is structural mistreatment of people in other places, but the United States stands alone in our institution of slavery and the consequences.
No, no.
Someone also I see asked for recommended readings, Sue.
I do have quite a few. I tend to share those in our 6th class, but I would be happy to send them out ahead of time.
Excuse me just for 1 second. Paul, I have sent you an email about a text message, and I tried calling you. The alarm is going off at church.
Oh
You
my.
want me to go? You want to go?
Yeah, I'll head over there. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, Paul.
Jeez.
Duty calls. I was the administrator at Westminster Presbyterian Church, and when the fire alarm would go off at 2 a.m, I could make it from my home in Hockessin to downtown Wilmington, a distance of about 9 miles in about 6.5 minutes.
Wow.
So back to the readings, may I jump in?
Sure.
If you want a relevant reading from an ELCA, I just heard about this today. There's a new podcast, a new book out called See Me, Believe Me, A Church Anew. It's an interview with the pastor who authored this book. She's done a podcast, and it talks about our church as the ELCA. And even today, if you want relevance, for those of you who have been tracking it in Iowa, Lutheran Social Services has accepted the Afrikaner refugees that have come to help them resettle. And the clergy is none too happy with this. And needless to say, this is a very relevant topic, just not out there in our history, but in the ELCA today.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lee?
Yeah, it was interesting. You were talking about earlier the slaves taking the owners' names, and when I was in Maryland, one of the station managers of the Metro in the Maryland area, I was told that I had to meet him, and my last name is Trueheart, and his last name was Trueheart as well. And when I walked up, I was in uniform. He looked at me and he was so excited. He was Black. And he said, "We're family. Come to our family reunion." And it was just interesting because he recognized that it was, obviously not genetics, but it was through the family name and everything else. So it was interesting to see that.
Quite an experience. Isn't that something? I have a longtime friend. His name is Al Gray. I talk with him frequently. We were colleagues, and I was speaking with him a couple weeks ago, and he said his father's youngest sister all of a sudden sent him information about a plantation in Georgia, where he's from. And apparently, there's an indication that their ancestors came from there. And so he went to visit it, and it's called Graybill Plantation. And so the expectation is that his last name, Gray, was as a consequence of his ancestors being on that plantation. Well, I know your time is precious, and I don't want to take up more than we have allocated. I'm very grateful that you're here, and I look forward to seeing you next week. We are going to explore the loophole in the 13th Amendment. We're going to come to understand laws that were passed in southern states known as Black codes that only applied to Black people. We're going to look at Jim Crow laws and the consequences of same. And we're going to see how once slavery ended, the power structure used the tools at hand, often great violence, to keep the Black population in line. And it's a difficult period, but one that is essential that we understand, because it gives us a different grasp on relationships between communities of color and police, on voting rates, on incarceration rates. It will shine a light on what I think is a lesser known portion of our history. So I look forward to seeing you next week.
Sue?
Yeah.
Sue, I just wanted to say that we were so impressed by your wealth of knowledge, and thank you so much for this. I think there was so much information that next time we're going to take notes and sort of organize, so then we can come up with questions that we might have. But we were so intent on taking in all of your wonderful information this time. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. I said it's a little like a fire hose, so I understand. But thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Pastor Karras, for arranging all of this.
You're welcome. Thank you. I look forward to seeing everybody this time next week as well. Have a great night.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.